So the purpose of this video is going to be to review function notation. So if you remember when you learned how to write the equations of lines in Algebra 1, you started with this form y equals mx plus b. And so what we do when we switch to function notation is instead of saying y, we start writing this as f of x. And it doesn't have to be f of x. We could use g of x. You could use any letter you want in front. But what it is doing is it's making sure you understand that this is a function where x is the input, so a number you're going to be plugging in, and that f of x is your output. All right. So if I asked you to evaluate f of 2, what that does is it tells us that in the function 3x plus 1, plug in a 2 for the x. If I said f of negative 4, that's telling me that in the function f of x, plug in negative 4 for your x value. And then you're getting an output of 7 and 11 when we plug those numbers in. All right. Now, what's very important to realize here is that when we use function notation, we're actually just writing points out. So if I'm plugging a 2 in and getting a 7, that means I have the point 2, 7. If I'm plugging in a negative 4 and the output is 11, then I'm plugging in a negative 4, that's my x value, and my output, which is my y, would be 11. So these would be 2 points on the graph of 3x plus 1. So let's just look at some examples. All right, so what we just talked about is the fact that f of a equals b. So when you plug in a number, you're going to get a number back. And this is your input and your output, your a, b written as a point. So when I say f of some number, so that symbol means number, means you're going to plug the number into the function. So if we go ahead and let's just look at an example. If I switch f of x to now be 2x minus 5, and I ask what is f of 2, that means where my x is, right? Instead of having an x, I now have a 2. So when I go to evaluate this, I'm going to keep this 2 alone, but now I don't want to write x anymore because we've been told what to replace the x with, which is a 2, so I would have a 4 minus 5, which is a negative 1. So to answer in both of the formats, we would say, one way would be to say f of 2 equals a negative 1. The other way would be to write this as a point. So when the input, which is the x, was a 2, my output, which was the answer, was a negative 1. All right, so then let's go ahead and look at another example. Sometimes you're going to have to do 2 functions at the same time, or 2 operations at the same time, and then just add your numbers together. So this is a 3-step process. So first I'm going to evaluate f of negative 4. So f of negative 4 would be a 2 times negative 4 minus a 5. So that would be a negative 8 minus 5, which would be negative 13. So f of 4, this whole thing is a negative 13. Then we have to evaluate it at 0 also. So if I go ahead and I evaluate f of 0, I'm going to have a 2 times a 0 minus a 5. So then I would get 0 minus 5. So this is a negative 5. So what we just figured out is this whole expression is a negative 5. So what we're being asked to do here is add them together. So negative 13 plus a negative 5, and my final answer here would be negative 18. All right, so you just have to do the 2 operations separately and then bring them together. All right. So again, let's just one more little curveball we're going to throw at you in this part. If I ask you for f of x is a negative 4x plus 1, and I say to find f of 5. F of 5 means we should be plugging in a 5 for the x. So negative 20 plus a 1 gives me negative 19. So that would make the point 5, negative 19. The input was a 5, the output was a negative 19. So here's our curveball. This one says find x. That means find the input when f of x equals 5. So remember what f of x equals, that was my output. That's what our answer should have been. So we actually have to work backwards in this problem. So I would say f of 4x plus 1, when does this function actually equal a 5? Because it's asking us to find the x value, find x. So now we just solve this. So I would subtract the 1, so I would get negative 4x equals 4. When I divide, I get x is a negative 1. So now we found the x value that gave us the output of 5. All right. So let's just do one more of these to make sure you understand it. So this one says g of x equals negative 3x plus 1. Find the value of x for the following. So notice this is not saying g of 10, right? If it said g of 10, then you would plug in the 10. But this is not the same thing, right? So this is not what to do in this problem. Instead, it's telling me my answer, my output, should be a 10. So what x value for this function would give me an answer of 10? So when I subtract the 1, I get negative 3x equals 9. So x equals negative 3. So that told me that if I were to plug in a negative 3, my final answer would have been a 10. All right. And then finally here, if we do the same thing, negative 3x plus 1 equals 10. Oops, sorry, negative 17. We changed the output. So when I subtract the 1 here, I get negative 3x equals negative 18. So I get x is 6. So my answer, input 6, output negative 17. All right, so if you have the function, you're just plugging in the numbers, you just have to be careful, are you given the input or the output? When you're given a graph, it's even easier as long as you recognize this idea that f of AB is just giving you a point. So if they ask you f of 1 equals, that just means could you complete this point? At 1, what is your y value? So what you would do is just go along your graph, right? Go along your graph, and this is where x is 1. Well, at 1, I'm at the point 1, 0. So f of 1 is 0. All right, let's do 2 more. If I said f of 4 means go along your graph until you get to 4 and see where your y value is. So my y value is all the way down here at negative 3, so I have the point 4, negative 3. So my point is 4, negative 3, which is why f of 4 equals negative 3. And last but not least, f of 2. So we would come over here to 2, we would look to C, and I would get a negative 3 also because of the point 2, negative 3. Now, on a graph, you could also, and this is the last thing we're going to do in this video, I could also ask you, where does f of x equal, and let's just say 0. All right, for what values of x does f of x equal 0? So remember, this is asking me, where would the y value be a 0? All right, now if I was looking at this graph, I would see here we already found one, right? So I know the 0.10, but this is when you're given the y value, it's a little tricky because you've got to double check. Notice over here I also have the 0.50. So if I were asked this question, so if this was part D, and I said, what x values does the function equal 0? You would answer with when x is 1 and 5. And that's a little bit of a challenge there. So take a second and just kind of let that kind of soak in your brain and see if you can make sense of it.